Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk. I hope everyone's GDC is going. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk. I hope everyone's GDC is going really well so far. Our talk is going to be on the benefits of a customized Reaper pipeline for Barrett. I'm a dialogue coordinator at Naughty Dog. I worked on The Last of Us Part 2, and back in the day, I worked on some Jackbox party packs, as well as Drawful 2.
I'm Julius Kukla. I'm also a dialogue coordinator. I previously worked on Last of Us Part 2, as well as some various theater and television productions before that.
And I'm Grayson Stone, senior dialogue coordinator. I worked on Last of Us Part 2, as well as Uncharted Lost Legacy, and prior to that, some various podcasts and audio dramas. So before we dive into things, some initial considerations. We feel that our workflow and the process to develop the tools are accessible to teams of all sizes. Even though Naughty Dog is AAA of studio, majority of our tools and the tools programming was done by one person, Julius, during heavy production while learning how to script and how to use Reaper's open API, which does most of the heavy lifting. Also, these tools are more of a midpoint, not something to churn out a final product or solution. They get us 90% of the way there, which in turn allows us to spend more time fine-tuning takes, cuts, and leveling. It also allows us to put a more human touch on the final assets. And lastly, a shout out to our dialogue lead, Magid Khalil, and former Naughty Dog sound designer, Jeremy Rogers, for sending us down the Reaper rabbit hole, and also to Emily Scrivener for programming some of our early tools. So what is it that our tools do? And in a sense, what does a lot of our work entail? Well, we ingest the raw recorded files, cut out the silence between lines, and place them accordingly on the timeline. Then we bring all the selected lines up to our leveling spec so they can sit well in the mix prior to our mastering chain. And then lastly, we check everything in-game against the mix and against other lines to ensure that nothing stands out that shouldn't, and anything that does need to stand out does. And if you haven't had to do this work, you're pretty lucky because it is extremely tedious. There's massive amounts to do, upwards of 1 million individual takes to sort through for a whole game, and there's typically not a lot of time to do it all. So what is it that our tools do? They give us more time to focus on the more artistic side of the work. This allows us to further fine-tune the final mix. We can get lines in the game faster. The sooner that we have assets in game, the sooner we know whether or not they actually work and if we need pickups. And along with that, it gives us more time and other teams more time to debug issues surrounding dialogue, which can drastically affect players' experiences. Also, our tool refining process lends to some great team building moments and can be a lot of fun, but we'll touch on that more later. So our first tool in the process is stacking. And here's what that looks like when we do it manually. We get the raw session and we start cutting around the lines. We're cutting out the silence in between each take. As we're doing this, we reference the cue sheet. We listen back to each line, make sure everything matches 1-to-1. And after we've cut out all the silence, then we place the alternate reads in the correct position below other reads. Just like this. Bring that file down, move everything over. You can see it takes a lot of time. Got to nudge it over just a little bit. And then we have to do the exact same thing to the next file. And we have to do it to every file in this session, which I would say is relatively small session. And we have to do this for upwards of 1,000 sessions for a game. Like I mentioned, it's very tedious. So let's see a less tedious version of this work. We've run our tool. We set our desired variables, which we'll get to more in a bit. Select our cue sheet. Run the tool. And it's done. That's it. And we get a nice little message saying that there are no errors. That entire process took less time than cutting the first file we saw. So let's take a closer look at one of these stacked files. So along with spacing the files out uniformly and stacking alternate lines in the correct position, we also get a nice little item note indicating which take is which, 52A, 52B, so on and so forth. And we can see that take 54 is just alternate reads for the third line. So what do we know about stacking? Well, it's the most paint by numbers work, trademark, quite literally. We have line X, which goes in position Y. It's strictly objective decisions, which is what computers are best at. We know the number of lines recorded, how many reads of each line, and we know where each take lives on the timeline. So figured, why not utilize all of that data? The only thing missing is making the cuts. And there are a myriad of strip silence tools out there, but rather than introduce a separate step or a new tool into the pipeline, figured we just build our own incorporated into the tool. Now let's take a look at a sample cue sheet. The column headers here give us all the data we need for the markers, through the scene, for the tracks, through the characters, and then all the tick data we could want here in the last column. And here's the corresponding tick itself. We just want the tool to cut between the lines and name the files. And if we're able to maintain this strict standardization structure and have any kind of contingencies for likely human errors that do pop up, then we'll be able to address those issues and have the tool running properly. So let's take another look at the tool running. So we'll run our tool, and we have, again, our three variables. The first is threshold, which is pretty standard across strip silence tools. It indicates what level is considered silence and should be cut out from the files. There's also minimum silence length, which kind of acts as a buffer for between lines. Let's get back to that video file. So the minimum silence is the buffer between lines. And lastly, we indicate whether or not we want the tool to cut on this pass. We hit yes, select our cue sheet, and almost immediately we get an error. But this is actually a good thing. We want to know when there's errors. And this error message tells us all the information we need to know in order to correct the issue and get the tool back on track. So here we can see the issue lies with take or file 160, missing take A, which character it's for, which sheet or tab within the workbook of our cue sheet the issue lies, and which row the issue lies in. So let's take a look at our cue sheet one more time. So we're already on the correct tab, and we want to go down to row 240, which is so nicely highlighted for us already. Come on over to the takes column, and we can pretty quickly see that this shouldn't be 160. The surrounding cells all say 106. This needs to be 160. And this is an actual error that we'll get in our sessions. Just human error as we're going through recording, it happens. So we'll quickly fix this, change it from 160 to 106, save the file, and rerun the tool. So we'll do that again. Run the tool, set our variables, find -50 for the threshold to be pretty good. Select our newly updated cue sheet, and now it's running through all the files. And there it is. It's done making all of the cuts. Now, the sections here that are blue, everything has been cut and stacked properly. All the files are in the place that they need to be. Everything that's red either has too many or too few cuts than what's expected from the cue sheet. So let's take a closer look at one of those errored sections. We get this nice error message that tells us take 55. There are 10 items, but it was expecting 9. And if we take a look at the files themselves, it becomes pretty apparent for an editor that this last one probably isn't the one that we need. It's the extraneous take. So they'll listen to it, probably hear the actor responding to some direction or making a joke, and then delete it. And then they'll move on to the next error section. And most of these are similarly easy to fix, just deleting 1 or 2 extra files or making 1 or 2 extra cuts and then moving on. So let's take a look at what happens behind the scenes. Tool first gets the marker locations in the session. Then it reads the cue sheet for all the lines, takes, scenes, characters, and tabs. It similarly reads a session for all files and other pertinent data. After gathering all that information, it's able to strip silence all items based on the user variables. Then, if the number of stripped lines match the cue sheet, the files are placed in the correct time and track. And after that, labels each line with the corresponding take number, which we saw in the top left of each item. And lastly, if there are any errored sections, it'll add a note, highlight it red, and move everything to the right. That way it stands out for the editor and they know exactly where to hone in for making fixes. Now that we've seen the tool in action and have some knowledge of the backend, let's look at the hard numbers. From what we've seen so far, the tool is able to do the work fairly well. But if taking time to fix errors along the way doesn't save us any time in the long run compared to doing the manual work, what's the point? Well, with our work with it so far, even with taking that extra time to fix the errored sections, we're confident in saying that using the stacking tool results in an average of 90% reduction in editing time. And we feel that's a pretty massive win. And here's some further numbers to support that. A session with 839 assets that takes 8 hours to cut and stack by minutes with our tool support. Another session that takes 5 hours to cut and stack by hand only takes about 15 minutes using our tool. And you can see other results there as well. Now, the reason for the discrepancy between asset count and editing time is due to a number of reasons. Some sessions take more prep time before using the tool. They might need to be split up and organized differently, and some just come back with more human error than others. But as you can see, all the session times trend downward considerably. And if we break it down to a per asset level, what takes nearly 19 seconds per item to cut and stack, with our tool, it is less than 2 seconds. Again, we think that is a pretty remarkable time and energy savings. And so that's our stacking tool. I'm going to pass it on now to Julius, who'll be talking about our leveling tool. Julius.
All right. So as Grayson mentioned, I'm going to walk everyone through the leveling process that we have at Naughty Dog, as well as the tool that we use to do most of it. This tool was first created on The Last of Us Part 2, and it quickly became one of our pivotal parts of our pipeline. So you all know the familiar, more tedious way of leveling files by hand. As you can watch in the video, you're constantly playing back the file, incrementally adjusting the volume to match the spec or the value that you need it to hit. As you can see in the video, this is a very long and arduous process when you're doing this process for thousands and thousands of files. By our own measure, the average editor is able to level roughly 3 linear minutes of dialogue within an hour. This is good, but it's not really fast enough to account for the increasing scale of video games and all the dialogue that we have to put in them now. So when we were looking into developing this tool, we had 2 major goals in mind. One, it had to level a lot of files as quickly as possible. This would give us the ability to get to other sessions faster, get files to implementer sooner, and just reduce everyone's backlog of work. The second goal was to mimic our own hand leveling style when we are leveling items. This would allow us to fix potential issues in the mix of the game sooner, since we have a closer representation of what we want in game, instead of using something like a more traditional batch normalizer. And it would also allow us to preserve the more handcrafted nature that we try to keep to when we're leveling our files. With all that said, here's a quick look at what the tool actually does. As you can see, the answer is pretty simple. This tool levels exactly what we want it to the volume that we want it to. More detailed though, this tool is capable of making general item volume adjustments, tuning the overall volume of the item, and then it goes in and makes more fine-tuned adjustments using the envelope volume, singling out specific syllables or phrases that might be over the spec. But before we delve into more details of this tool, let me clear up some more Reaper-centric terminology that we use at Naughty Dog, just in case people aren't familiar with them. First off, when I'm talking about the word item, this is just referring to a specific line or a specific file. As an example, this image to the right is just an item. Now, when I mention item volume, that's going to be talking about the generic volume that boosts or lowers the entire file instead of individual moments of it. This is symbolized by the red line in the item, and it's currently highlighted by that red box. This stands to reason that that blue line is going to be the envelope volume. This is the automation that allows for more fine-tuned individual adjustments at specific moments in time, rather than just applying a general boost or reduction across the entire file. So for the moment you've all been waiting for, here's the tool that I've been talking about so much. As you can see, this is our handy leveler tool. It's got a perfect UI that definitely makes sense after looking at it for as long as we have, but broken up into specific sections. You have in the top left an area where you can choose the different projection tags you're trying to level. Choosing each of these projections will automatically change the variables that the tool uses in order to level the files, so saving everyone time as you don't have to do it by hand. Directly to the right of that, you can see the variables that the tool uses in order to figure out how to even level the items in the first place. Below those two boxes, you have a custom search text box, and this allows us to filter through all the selected items, keeping only the items that we want to level selected. So for example, if I only want to level the items with breath in their name, I can just type breath into the text box, hit that nice filter takes button, and this is going to unselect any item that doesn't have breath in the name, making sure that we aren't accidentally leveling files we don't mean to be leveling. And last but not least, we have all the different functions and some more options that the tool can utilize and that tells the tool what to do in this bottom portion. But I'll delve into some of those more later. So now that you know what the tool looks like, let's listen to some comparisons between hand-leveled files and items that are leveled by the tool. So first off, for just a quick visual comparison, you can see an item that are leveled by hand in the image to the left, and the same item leveled by the tool in the image to the right. For the most part, they're very similar, with the main difference being some more stylistic ones from when it comes to how I personally level items. But more importantly, I'm going to play these files for you so you can listen to them and hear the differences, since we're all audio people and listening is a pretty important part of the job. You're going to hear a file that contains 3 lines of various projection tags. Each line is going to be repeated twice, with the first playback being hand-leveled and the second playback being the tool-leveled version. So here goes. See if you can hear any of the differences between the hand-leveled lines and then their tool-leveled counterparts.
We gotta get through there. We gotta get through there. Path ahead kicks out toward downtown. Path ahead kicks out toward downtown. Hey, where are you two? Hey, where are you two?
All right, so now that auditory I Spy game is done, if anyone noticed any differences, the most obvious one to me is going to be that second example, where the tool-leveled file is a little bit quieter than the hand-leveled file. But even with these differences, it's still pretty close to the hand-leveled version, and it saves us a lot of time in the long run, even if we do occasionally have to double back and fix every rogue volume adjustment every now and then. So how does the tool do it? It can use a few variables and techniques in order to accomplish its goal. The first one's going to be that peak and RMS spec value, which are used in order to tell the tool what to level the item to in the first place. These variables are stored in a file and associated with specific projections. So as I mentioned before, selecting a projection is going to change these variables automatically, making sure that the tool is using the correct values and that you're not accidentally leveling something incorrectly. It's going to then take into account the style or the mode that you want to level the file using, which can be either leveling the item by item volume, envelope volume, or both. This is selected by choosing an option in this drop-down menu. But what's the difference between each mode? As I mentioned before, leveling an item using item volume is only going to adjust the overall volume of the item, causing any boost or reduction to apply to the whole thing. This is represented in that top image, and it's good for shorter items, such as efforts. Leveling by envelope volume, on the other hand, which is shown in that middle image, is going to level the item by adding and adjusting individual envelope points within time. And as I'm sure you guessed by now, leveling by both is going to combine these techniques, which is demonstrated in that bottom image. This is the mode that we use in order to mimic a more traditionally hand-leveled file, using item volume for adjustments that need to apply to the entire item. Say the whole thing needs to be lowered by 2 dB, and then going in and using the envelope points for more detailed changes. Additionally, though, this tool uses some other variables in order to decide where to place envelope points when adjusting the envelope volume. The first one of these is going to be cycles. which is used to determine how far the envelope points should be placed from each other when leveling by peak value. As you can see, lower cycle values represented in the image to the left cause more individual points to be added for more granular volume changes. And then higher cycle values, on the other hand, have less points as the tool can expand one point, including any others that might be too close to it and encompassing them, which you can see on the image to the right. As such, there's an inverse relationship between the cycles and how many points are added, with lower values creating more points and then higher values creating less points. The same can be said for the next variable, window, which also has an inverse relationship with the amount of points added. Additionally, this variable is used to determine the amount of time in milliseconds that you want to calculate that RMS value over. And then finally, there's going to be the tension variable. Although this is different from cycles and windows, this variable is still incredibly important since it determines how sloped or curved the envelope should be between the newly added points. This adjusts how strong the volume changes between the 2 points on playback. And as you can see in the image, a lower value leads to a more linear envelope, while a higher value leads to a more sloped one. With all that said, I should also mention that these images are on the more dramatic side of values, since we never really use values as high or low as the ones depicted, but these help get the point across visually better. And I would also be a bit remiss to say that we didn't start out with this current version of the tool. This is only as good as it is because of the numerous iterations it's gone through since we originally created it. The very first version of this tool, which is Grayson pointed out, was created by Emily Scrivener, one of our dialogue designers, was the one that we used to ship The Last of Us Part 2 with. This version only adjusted the item volume, but it was exactly what we needed during that point in time in order to complete that game. After, though, we upgraded the tool to version number 2, which gave it the ability to adjust envelope points. Although in theory, this was a great idea and exactly what we wanted and needed, we kind of realized that the abundance of envelope points is a bit problematic and that they were really poorly placed, which led to very audible volume changes. So moving on, we took those lessons and created version number 3, which is the current iteration of this tool. With this, it became more of a refined system in adding envelope points, allowing one point to expand and include an entire syllable or phrase. And it also came with the ability to level using both item volume and envelope volume, which, as I mentioned before, effectively mimics how we hand level our files. So armed with all of this information on how the tool works, here's an example of what it's like to just level a session using this tool. So as you can see in a second, this tool is, it's pretty fast. Even with me taking that time to realize the tool is finished leveling a projection or misclicking a button, it only takes around 40 seconds to level a session of 270 items. This means that the tool is leveling an item in roughly 1/6 of a second right now, with the caveat that a session containing longer files is going to take slightly longer to level. And this is without further optimizations that we chose not to make. Making these optimizations, though, can speed the tool up even more. So what does this mean when comparing it to a human? As I mentioned earlier, by our own account, the average editor can level 3 minutes of dialogue in an hour. Using this session as an example, the tool is capable of leveling 270 minutes of dialogue within an hour, making it 90 times more efficient than just the average editor. But before you go ahead and, get really happy about never leveling a file by hand again, I am going to stress that this tool still has a ways to go before it's perfect. This is a graph of how accurate the tool is when leveling files, with the x-axis being how many decibels the leveled file is from the given spec value, and the y-axis being the percentage of files off by that given decibel amount. So for example, that first pair of columns shows that 31% of systemic files, which is the blue column, are within 0.5 dB of the spec value that they're trying to hit, whereas 25% of story files are within that same range. And as you may notice, story files tend to be off by a more significant margin across the entire graph than systemic files are. And this is largely due to the tool's weak points, which are more significant when they're leveling longer, more dynamic files, or essentially that's the definition of story files. So we are actively working to improve these statistics, by improving things like envelope point placement. And we are also looking at adding the ability to automatically adjust the tension variable depending on whatever the context of that envelope point is. But all in all, this tool, although it's still a work in progress, it has already become incredibly useful. And it clearly shows the amazing things that you can do within Reaper and the way that you can just save so much time using Reaper. But this concludes the leveling portion of the talk. So I'm going to give it over to Tom, and he can talk about our random file player.
Thank you, Julius. As Julius mentioned, I'm going to take everyone through our random file player. So towards the end of development on The Last of Us Part 2, when we are at the point where we were quality checking both the leveling and the performances of our systemic content, or what some studios refer to as BARCs, we quickly realized how important speed was going to be in this process. Because just for systemic content alone, we had over 150,000 files spread across 27 characters, and it was mostly up to two people, myself and one of our other dialogue coordinators at the time, Eric Schmall, to make sure all of this sounded as polished as possible. Now, when conducting a listen through a single marker of content, we could conduct a pass linearly. However, if there are enough files within that marker, it could introduce a slight leveling bias over time. And it's also not completely accurate to how these files will play in game, since a file will be played at random from within the marker. Now, we could skip around and try to play markers at random from within the marker. However, we're humans, and as much as we try sometimes, humans aren't actually random. This also divides our focus. Not only are we trying to focus on the leveling or the performances of the files, we're also trying to make sure we're skipping around and being random enough that we're hitting every file. And this could cause us to lose focus pretty often, which may seem minor, but over the period of months of polishing, those moments really add up. And it's also just not very fun. It's not a fun process to go through and try to randomly skip through content and make sure you're listening critically the whole time. Now, alternatively, what if we had a tool that we could open up at any time, search within a specific region, find a specific marker, add that marker to a queue, and then have the tool autoplay files from that marker for us. So we can just focus on listening, and that's it. Now that's fun, because as Grayson mentioned, Reaper is fun. So this tool is our random file player. This tool has become one of our most efficient ways to quality check both the leveling and performances of our content. But once started as an idea to play files at random from within a single marker, has evolved over time to become one of our most versatile tools. So shortly after coming up with the idea for this tool, we thought to ourselves, what if we added the ability to add multiple markers to the queue? So what would it look like if we wanted to use this tool to check how some of our efforts, particularly jump larges and land larges, may sound together when played in game? So first, we want to select the proper region, select our marker, and press the Add Markers button to add our marker to the queue. After that, we're going to press Play Markers in Order so that the tool plays the markers in the same order that they appear in the queue. We're also going to autoplay the files and add a global wait of 0.3 seconds. This will just tell the tool, hey, wait 0.3 seconds before playing through each marker. And then we're going to press play and see how it all sounds. Now I'm going to try to guess and read your mind here. And I'm going to guess that you're thinking, hey, that's pretty neat. But what about lines? Which that's a very good question, very astute of you to ask. Well, we can actually use the random file player to emulate how systemic content might play and chain together and get in game using some additional features the tool has. So in the following example, we'll try to create what it might sound like if one of our enemy NPCs in The Last of Us Part 2 finds the body of one of their fallen squad mates. So as always, our first step is to add our markers. We can also double click on the markers themselves to add them to our queue, which is a nice little quality of life feature that we added. We're then going to check Play Markers in Order, and we're going to autoplay the files once again. And we're also going to add custom wait times for each marker within the queue to try to more closely emulate how these might actually fire off in game. And then we're going to press play and see how it all sounds together.
Colin, everything all right? The hell are you doing? Oh no. One of ours is down! Gavin? You okay? Hey! Respond! Oh no. One of us is down!
Now, again, you might be thinking, wow, that's awesome. But what about multiple characters, which is another great question. So using even more additional features that the tool has, we can fairly easily try to replicate what it might sound like in game if an enemy NPC commands their squad mates to conduct a search and that search comes up empty. So we start by selecting our markers and adding them to our queue. We can also shift click to highlight multiple markers at once. And by pressing the add markers button, it adds them all in one fell swoop, which is really nice. We're going to play the markers in order. And we're also going to turn on play files from all main character tracks since we want the tool to play content from multiple characters. We're going to autoplay the files. And we're also going to change a value in this times column for the first time. And we're just going to tell the tool, hey, play this first marker twice before moving on to the next markers within the queue. We're also going to add our custom wait times to get it closer to how it might sound in game. And we're going to press play and see how it all sounds together.
Jorge, Colin, check it out.
Watch my back.
Any luck?
Yeah, no, I got nothing.
Okay. Jorge, Lee, scope it out.
Copy that.
You find anything?
That's a negative.
Okay then.
Now, one last time, I'm going to try to guess what you're thinking. Wow. Now that's fun. Because Reaper isn't just extremely useful, it's also extremely fun. So, in summary, we can quality check the leveling of content, quality check the performances of content, and something that wasn't even covered in this talk is that we can also use this tool to prototype new systems, all without ever leaving Reaper. There's no need to export the files out, implement them in game for a first pass. We can do a first pass all within Reaper itself. So that's our random file player. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Grayson.
Thanks, Tom. Wow, that was fun. Thanks for taking us on that ride. So now that you've seen the tools in action, you can see how useful they are and hopefully see the advantages that Reaper brings to the table for dialogue production. And not to belabor a point too much, but what is it that our tools do? They save us time, massive amounts of time. They save us time and effort cutting content. They give us a better first pass at leveling than a typical normalizer. And they allow us to test individual lines and conversations prior to implementation. And these are just 3 of our most powerful tools, but there are many others that are just as important to our workflow. And we're constantly improving our current tools to be even better. And if you or your team are interested in diving into making your own Reaper tools, the Reaper community and forums are a pretty good place to start. And that just about wraps up our talk. But as I mentioned at the beginning, and as Tom amazingly demonstrated with the random file player, we also have a lot of fun with Reaper. Early on, we realized that Reaper's splash screen can be swapped out to display whatever image we want. So the 3 of us decided to start a dialogue team building initiative, or DTI for short, as a way to have fun and have some laughs while developing this gritty game. So periodically, any one of us might swap out the splash screen with whatever inside joke, new meme, or random thought popped into our heads. And so that might take the form of a holiday greeting from the team, or maybe a message for someone who is out sick on the day of their birthday. Who wouldn't want to come back to the office to see that when they launch Reaper? Or maybe just as a nice way to remember a holiday party, or misremember that holiday party, or play a game of which face of our dialogue lead maggot is the real one. And that's it. We're now going to open up to Q&A segment. So if you have any questions for us or think you know which one is the real maggot, come on up.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Very impressive. I'm wondering if you can go a bit in detail into how you manage the versions of Reaper across all of your people. mostly also from the work from home perspective of like, how do you make sure everyone has that same splash screen when they load Reaper, pretty much?
So with the splash screen, for example, so this is in terms of how we manage version control of Reaper, as well as how everyone's pointing to the same script location or splash screen location. Most of our tools are stored in our server, which Reaper is able to pull from paths on servers and like that. So that's how we're able to keep that the same. And with version control of Reaper, it's mainly just if there's a specific version that we need of Reaper, we kind of just say, hey, make sure you're just on this version. I, being the person who kind of checks the tools the most, I'm the one going and checking various dev versions of Reaper to make sure our tools still work on upgraded newer versions. But if everything seems good and if everything checks out, then I'll just mention to the team, hey, we can upgrade now. And then everyone will just do a massive upgrade.
Okay, and if I may just follow up on that question, Reaper being very customizable and can be very personal, I'm thinking shortcuts and these kind of things. Do you rather take the approach of having everyone have their own shortcuts on their machine if they like to, or rather standardize across all of Naughty Dog's Reaper users?
So so in terms of having more flexibility when it comes to customization and mouse modifiers, key commands, we kind of take a mixed approach. We have very specific ones that we ask for everyone to keep. So we have a few tools that are very, hey, please have this on set to this key in case we have to jump on your computer or jump into and help you or whatever. We can just quickly navigate around and use the same tools. But when it comes to our lesser used tools and functions like that, we actually just allow our editors to kind of map their own buttons, because we do realize everyone has a different editing style. Everyone has, even like hand shape is different. So some keys are harder to reach than others. And so we recognize that and we allow for it.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, thank you for the very detailed talk. I do have a few questions, so we'll see if there's any more people want questions. But did you experiment with speech recognition at all for any part of the tool? Did you consider that?
So we haven't yet. That's been something that's kind of on the docket to get to at some point, but unfortunately we have a lot of tool work to do. So it's one of those future proofing ideas that we're gonna hopefully get to at some point in time.
Cool.
And that's more specifically for that stacking tool is what we're looking at adding speech recognition for.
Mm-hmm. And with the stacking tool, if you had takes in different orders, does it take that into account, or is that just relying on the director's notes to be as accurate as possible? So we try to keep the stacking tool doesn't handle text in different order, mainly because we want our cue sheet to reflect what is in the session. So that's actually a step that we have assigned to the editors. When you are stacking a session, we want you to either change the cue sheet to reflect the session order or vice versa. Mm-hmm. Cool. Sorry, I do have a few more if I've got time. The analysis for the leveling, did you look at using LUFS type measurement or?
Yeah, so we at Naughty Dog, or on the dialogue team specifically, I should say, we don't use LUFS measurement. That's for a few various reasons that trickle down from my dialogue lead, as he's the one that is really driving these different spec values that we are hitting for the mix. But the short and sweet answer is we tend to side with RMS instead of LUFS, just because RMS does a better job, in our opinion, over short files instead of longer files, like LUFS tends to be better with.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Can you describe why there was such a discrepancy between the story and systemic loudness?
Yeah, so the difference when it comes to leveling files, systemic files compared to story files, A large portion of it just has to do with our story files are longer and more dynamic, which we haven't really been able to optimize the tool to reflect.
Sure.
A lot of our tools are first created with the guise of working on systemic files because that is the vast majority of our content. So once we get to that point, we then start to mix them into working with story stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. I suppose story dialogue is more likely to have different projection types throughout the individual line.
Yeah, that is a great example as to why. It's just a bit more dynamic. And
is there any scope to add markers within the line to denote different projection types, do you think?
Not at the current point in time, but maybe in the future.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Just one slightly random other question. I was wondering your aesthetic approach to breaths, sort of at the start and ends of lines. Is there any sort of general approach, or is it just case by case?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Our general rule is that if there are breaths at the end of a file, we try to end on an inhale, and we try to keep that consistent so that whenever it's going into any other sort of content with breathing, that kind of just stays consistent throughout. Now, as far as like our certain lines or efforts that have certain breaths attached to them, that is more of a case by case basis, and at that point, that's when we have a bit of a nice running dialogue with our dialogue designers to make sure, like, oh, should we keep these breaths and these performances, or maybe one of our actors is giving us some really good post life on a certain effort, and we can communicate with them to see if that's something we want to keep, or do we want it more consistent across the characters. So it's more of a case by case basis and just keeping in constant communication with everyone putting our dialogue into the game.
Cool. And just one more, I promise. When it comes to the leveling and listening back, are you doing that on headphones or speakers, or is it?
Yeah, so all of the dialogue editors work off of headphones. Mm-hmm. They're the Beyerdynamic DT 1770 Pros is what we typically use.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks for all the questions. Great questions.
Yeah, great talk. Thanks so much. So for the stacking tool, sounds like there's some specific data that you need as input for it. How is that data collected in session? Is there a formalized mechanism, or you just say, hey, put it on the spreadsheet in this order, or do you have some specific guidelines that they say, yes, we need this and this and this so it can go in our stacking tool?
So yeah, our cue sheets are very organized. We have, as the example showed, we have columns where specific data goes into. So we have the character column, so we know which character belongs to, and it reads that to match up to the track, the correct track in the session. In the takes column, it's all just numbers and letters. And so the tool's reading that data and matching it up to where the cuts are in the session once it makes the cuts.
Okay, so that's just something the editor has to make sure they get right during the session. There's no tool that sort of checks that stuff or automates that?
No, yeah, and that's, okay. Yeah, correct. That's why we have those contingencies for the potential human errors, yeah.
Cool, awesome. For the first version, the one you said you shipped Naughty Dog with, or The Last of Us, how long did it take you from start to finish to get your version 1 of your Reaper tools?
So, if memory serves, the first version of the dialogue leveler was created maybe about a year and a half before we shipped the game. Then obviously we were pretty busy with the game, so we weren't able to upgrade it all that much. But then I want to say pretty quickly after ship, it was one of the first tasks on my to-do list was try and see what upgrades we can make to it. So I think maybe around like a year and a half or 2 years after that first version was when we were able to do it.
But in terms of like your hours for how long it took you to get the scripts done?
Oh, okay. So that one is, so as far as how often I'm working on scripts specifically, it's more, there's no steadfast rule. It's more depending on what the potential upgrade is gonna take. So I try to limit myself, depending, like if I have multiple sessions that I have to edit or something, I'll try to limit myself to only working a few hours a week or something on that to making these upgrades. Obviously, if there's a more critical bug fix, that's gonna take higher precedence in terms of my schedule personally. But typically, it really depends on the tool. It depends on how sophisticated it needs to be. And it also depends on just like what the upgrades we want to make and how important they are.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. It was fascinating to find out how much tools could help with this. But it leads me to the question, what is the next bottleneck do you have? And do you plan to use or create tools to fix it, or there's some things that just could be done by human?
So that's a great question. So the next bottleneck that we have to kind of fix, I would say the next bottleneck, it's not really a bottleneck, but the next thing is we just want to update all of these tools and make them all better. As we kind of showed, some of them do have issues that more work spent on them will be able to fix. As far as the next bottleneck, I know Grayson's been doing a lot on the recording side of making sure that that side of our pipeline has all the tools it needs. But I personally don't know of any, or can't think of many other bottlenecks that we have just one specific tool planned for.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question. You mentioned the Reaper forums. Do you have anyone maybe in mind specifically? Who do you recommend about learning and scripting and creating those type of tools?
I don't have, so for learning Reaper and learning Reaper's API and just in general how to script, I don't have anyone in specific in mind. I know from browsing the Reaper forums, anytime I encounter a question or a problem, there are a lot of people who are very good at utilizing Reaper's API, and just a general perusal of the forums is going to lead you to the exact people that you need to know. I know there are also a lot of video tutorials on how to script in Reaper on YouTube as well, so those are also very good.
Okay, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kurt Larson. I apologize if I missed this, I missed part of your talk, but did you speak to the question of Perforce or other version control integration with Reaper, and is that something you do? And if so, how and how well did it work?
Yeah, so we currently have, this question did come up slightly earlier, but for version control of Reaper, I'm typically the one that is checking various new Reaper updates. So
I'm sorry, I may have misspoken.
Oh, no.
I meant version control of your assets by integrating Reaper with a version control package like Perforce or SVN.
Okay. So as far as using Perforce within Reaper, we only use Perforce to hold our scripts. So when I'm updating, and this is a newer thing that we added after The Last of Us Part 2. So that is, Perforce controls the version control of all of our scripts just to make it way easier. And the old system was all of our editors had to copy over the new version of the script, and it took way too much time. So we were luckily able to change that. But as far as just normal assets go, we actually have various other version controls that we use.
And then the only other thing I was wondering is I spent many hours editing mostly the Russian, Polish, and a few other European languages of the VO for TLU 2, adjusting all those volume curves for the spojected and the projected and all of that. And the whole time I was wondering, what are they doing with these data? I mean, were you using Reaper as a sort of substitute for a sledgehammer compression plugin, or how was all that stuff I was doing, and how did that get used?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all the help you gave for us on that game. We definitely appreciate all the work you did.
Oh, I got paid.
Hey, good. Fair enough. But yeah, so the way that we look at our hand leveling, and I'm sure Grayson and Tom will also chime in, but just really quickly, we personally like to have a bit more hand-tuned fine-tuning to it, which is why we really emphasize using envelope volume for very specific, narrow things. So we tend to shy away from just using compressors and whatnot that take, a more algorithmic approach to it. We like having that hand approach. So.
Okay, so then you would take the final volume data and print out new versions of the VO files using the curves that people were making?
Yep, basically.
Okay. Yeah, that made sense. I kept asking, and Duncan at Formosa just said, yeah, man, I don't know. I don't know why we're doing this, man, but apparently it works really well. Cool, thanks.
We like to hope it works really well. It seems to, so that's the good part.
Hello, thank you guys for the talk. I was curious if there were any notable roadblocks or struggles when it came to implementing the tools for a team of people, like.
Yeah, so for kind of generalizing our tools team-wide, there's always differences from how one person expects the tool to work and how the other person expects to work. We have definitely gotten better at that. I know in the beginning, whenever I was creating a tool, I very narrow-mindedly made it for my pipeline, and then Grayson and Tom would find a whole bunch of either bugs, as well as the other editors would find a bunch of bugs or be like, hey, Julius, why does this do it like this? So that's something that we're constantly trying to improve, and we constantly update our tools to work for other editors to obviously fix those bugs that people run into. But it is definitely a challenge making sure that they work for everyone and they work how everyone wants. Every now and then, depending on the context, we might have to just push back and say, look, we can't do that right now. But for the most part, we try to account for everything.
Cool, thank you.